remember a friend now.
Okay, we got one friend. Okay.
His name is Max.
Okay.
He likes the Joker a lot.
Okay, there you go. Writer? So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find that person for you to collaborate with. You as the artist, you have to find that writer. Because that's the way you're going to create books. Because that's why you're here, right? It's to create comics.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're here to create comics, you're going to find that writer that you can pair with as the artist. And together you can build stuff together. Okay, that's what you're going to look for, right?
I have to jump in and say, because I've been teaching comic book writing to kids and sometimes to grown-up kids. And one of the things that I have come to believe more and more over time is that for aspiring artists, it's really important to learn elements of story. And for aspiring comic book writers, it's really important to stretch your art skills. And I think that when I was your age, I was just, how old are you? 12. So at 12, it was just the moment where I realized that other people drew a hell of a lot better than I did, so I was going to stop doodling. And it never occurred to me that just because other people drew better than I did, I could keep actually getting better. And so about 3 years ago, I realized I wanted to go back and study art, not because I'll ever draw a comic, but because I felt it would make me a better comic book writer. And also it made every artist who'd ever worked with me like roll and schadenfreude, like, that's what you call a foreshortened leg. But I felt it strengthened me. And
You were so trained by Karen, you know that, don't you? I hear it, oh man.
So I would say that, whatever you are interested in doing, it's really useful to strengthen that other skill, because even if you will never draw a comic, the ability to sketch out a panel and know if it's at least possible to draw that in some, clumsy form is just priceless.
Plus, it's useful to have a vocabulary that you can communicate with your artist and stuff. I actually had this problem, and actually Mark Chiarello helped me out with it because he gave me his book. I realized that I actually literally lacked the vocabulary to talk to colorists about what. So it was this ham-handed, like, it's kind of too greeny purple, so can you, do something about that? Which is not helpful for trying to get art on the page. But it's the same way, I do the same thing. I read books about art and film and stuff to get better at knowing how to communicate to the artist what's in my head. Now, the artist will almost always do something cooler, but the better I can communicate with them, the more smooth that process is, the better the work is. So whenever people ask me about that, I, like Alisa, always recommend that you try to read extensively. Even if you don't draw, read about drawing, read about art history, and get a sense of how the other people are doing what they do.
What's the worst rejection letter you ever got?
I've literally only ever gotten 2 rejection letters.
Really?
No, one was from Dark Horse, and it was just, oh, sorry, we didn't. It was funny, Dark Horse sent me a rejection letter 19 months after I sent the thing in, so I had assumed it was rejected. It was nice to get the letter. And they were very polite. The other one, which was actually the first rejection letter I ever got, was from 2080, and it is the best rejection letter I have ever seen. They are so polite and so nice and so cool, and I've actually talked with people who wrote for 2080, and they go, yeah, that was not a rejection letter. That was a fix these mistakes and do it again letter. And I assumed it was a rejection letter.
I'm so good, I haven't gotten any rejection.
I want to jump in though and say that the first step toward being a professional working artist or professional working writer is to get your first rejection.
Yeah.
Because that is a crucial moment. And I also want to jump in and say that there's this old model, this old paradigm that says, I used to wash the underside of horses and then I got my big break and now I'm set. And it does happen for some people that way. But for a lot of freelancers, there are career ups and downs. And so you break in, and then suddenly comes a new pharaoh who doesn't remember Joseph. And then, you have to sort of re-break in. And often, there's staffing changes, there's taste change, you created, Donut Woman, and then suddenly that did not go over well. And so the ability to deal with rejection and to sort of be resilient, hold on to your sense of worth and keep creating is probably like the most important thing. So I want you to go for that first rejection. We will support you in this.
Just experience failure.
Yes, because without that, you will not develop the calluses you need to walk barefoot.
I understood that, and I have might not be a rejection letter because I'm so good, but I've experienced failure.
Yeah, it's actually, it's interesting. For example, it wasn't like I was totally like locked out of the industry or even the company, but when DC moved to Burbank, most of the editors that I worked with at DC did not. So it wasn't quite like starting over, but that's the sort of thing you've got to be, used to. People who have worked with me and remember with me, there's, still editing stuff is there, but most of the sub-editors were not there, and you've just got to expect that stuff to happen in your career.
Yeah,
and also, I haven't gotten very many rejection letters. I've been rejected a lot, but mostly in comics, what you get is crickets. You just don't get an answer. You just assume that it's dead.
Yeah, and that's the hard part about it. I mean, you touched on something that was really interesting before, Lisa, about writing and working. And that was something that used to be pretty regular business, where the editors and the assistant editors used to write, or used to draw, be part of the process. And it's interesting because once you're on both sides of the table, you get a sense of understanding it better, about what the responsibilities are, what the job is, put the deadline on yourself, understand what it's going to do, and be able to take criticism from others too. This is part of the learning process. Something that's got lost over the years because we've gotten a little more corporate. We can't do it now officially, but it's something that I think was a valuable tool in its day.
I also have to point out that every time I write something now, I have to fill out a new questionnaire that proves that I'm not on staff at DC.
Yeah.
It's really
It's pretty insane, and it's something that I think is lost in it. It was interesting because in the earlier days, in the 70s, maybe up until the 80s, maybe, until royalties really kicked in for talent, most of the talent was better paid as an editor. So that's why you see a lot of big names editing books, the Kubricks, Dick Giordano, all these guys were these were the leaders in the business. They were incredible talents, but they actually had to become executives to be paid better than for the work that they did. And it was the royalties kick in, and then the rates start to change, and the system starts to expand a little bit more. And by doing so, it became more profitable to become the writer and the artist. What happened, unfortunately, on the editorial side was that editorial became more administrative, and the craft was lost. And you lost that people who were the talent teaching new talent, and that's one of the things that I felt, is always interesting. And when I sit and I joined, I was lucky enough to be able to talk with Julie Schwartz for a day here, and Dick Giordano for a day there, Joe Kubert, and all these guys, and I spent even Paul and Karen, and people that I spent a lot of time with learning the craft from these ones and building your repertoire. So you're going to have to listen and follow other people's work. We're here helping you. You know that, right? This is all around you. You know that now, right? Okay?
Okay.
Okay, good. I'm glad.
Yeah, I always have this ongoing question, and this is going to sound, and I hope, especially since, Dan's my natural boss, I don't mean it to sound bitter, but I'll get things like, oh, hey, can you drop a page on page 2 and put it on page 20? I'm like, as if I don't have to redo everything that's in the middle. Do you not understand or do you not care? Which, if the editor just doesn't care, which sounds bitter, I get that. That's their job. And if the story's better that way, cool. Yeah. If they don't know, that kind of bugs me. And I can't really ask them that. It's because it seems really snide to be that's way more work than you seem to think it is.
Well, actually, that goes back to part of my story, which was when we were working on Superboy. So we're doing Superboy, and Jimmy and I are working on a 6-part arc that starts at 94. It's going to end with issue 100. It's important to know. So we're working through the series, and all of a sudden, we get a call. I've turned in issue number 99, which is set up for the big 100 issue. Then I get a phone call saying, hey, we're going to do a crossover across the line in issue number 99. And I'm like, well, that's my big setup. And they're like, yeah, but you gotta understand something. At that particular moment, they go, Impulse, the comic Impulse was floundering. And they said, we're gonna try to support Impulse and lift Impulse by doing a crossover with Young Justice and Robin and Superboy and Impulse to get people excited about Impulse. That's the plan. Now, as this is occurring as I'm interviewing. Now, I'm interviewing, and as I'm interviewing, I'm checking all the sales numbers, okay? And at that particular moment, Impulse was selling about 17,000 copies. Superboy selling about 20,000 copies. And Young Justice is the bestseller at 24,000 copies. Now, as a person who has some experience with numbers, I'm saying that 24,000 book is not going to help a book sell at 17,000. So the crossover, in my point, Mine was moot, but they thought this was a great idea. And then they present me the overview. You get that overview with all the breakdowns of what you're supposed to put in your story. So I pick up the phone and I call up and I go, listen, and the problem with the story is Superboy's not in my issue, 99. It's not in the book. And the answer came back from editorial. Isn't that great? Every once in a while he should take a break from appearing in his own title. Okay? True story. Take a break. And I said, we're issue 99 leading to a big 100. I can't have it. And not only that, it's an alternate reality. That's the one, exactly.
Nice.
It's an alternate reality story. And I'm like, but I need, it's breaking in my story. So what we did is we took our issue number 99 that was originally written, we rewrote 98 and rewrote 100 in order to move the story out of 99. So they called and said, listen, you did great, you did good with it, everything worked out fine. And then the other books start coming in. First comes in Young Justice, has nothing to do with the crossover. And I was called up and they said, yeah, they just couldn't find a way to work it into their story. Right? Then the Robin issue comes in. There's only 4 pages of the crossover. And I go, there we go, 4 pages. And they go, yeah, the Robin story, they were building to a big arc. And therefore we didn't want to interrupt their story. And I said, we were going to 100. And then our issue comes out. And while it fit the story, at the same time our issue came out, I got the notice saying, oh yeah, Impulse is canceled. We didn't realize the crossover isn't going to help at all.
Wow.
No!
And then I got the job. And that's why we canceled the book at 100, and we canceled the editor too.
You know, this is kind of funny because it reminds me, I hadn't written any superhero stuff I think at this point, and Denny asked me if I would do a fill-in issue for No Man's Land, you know, and I was really excited. It's Batman. He's like, no, you don't get to write Batman. I said, oh, it's okay, Batgirl. No, you don't get to write Batgirl. Catwoman? Nope. Poison Ivy? Nope, you can't use any of the characters. And so I had my one issue of No Man's Land where I was not allowed to use any characters. So I basically, it's like a rabies fever dream in which all the characters appear.
There you go, you figured it out. But I mean, and that's the fun part about it, is you gotta take the jobs when they come in. And even with Superboy, we had an opportunity, so we had to make it work, because that's what we're told to do, even if it made no sense at all.
Yeah, that's the
But
thing.
it was interesting for me, because I came into the job then, I come into an editorial position, and we didn't do crossovers for a while. The first crossover we did wasn't until Infinite Crisis, because I said, let these books stand alone. And then, since we tell, I can tell another true story. Can I do another story? It's really hard. I'm doing all the bad stories today, so forgive me. But it feels like that panel. It's one of the other one was where when I first got into editorial, there was a lot of malaise at DC, and I walked into a room, and I did the list. I was big on sales numbers and math and all this stuff here. So we looked at the books and we said a periodical book at $250 sells 40,000 copies. A prestige book at $5 sells 25,000 copies. A hardcover at $20 sells 10,000 copies. They all make the same money. I said, well, I went to editorial. What would you rather do? And I said, they all go, let's make hardcovers. Let's do all hardcovers. That's where we're going to go. We get better paper. We're not on a schedule. We can put it out whenever we want. It looks great. I said, oh, great. You lose 5,000 fans. 40 becomes 35. 25 becomes 20. 5, 10 becomes 5. And I said, at 5,000 people, you're out of business. Yeah, I know, but we like making the high-end stuff. So I said, okay, you're not paying for this. Everybody used to get free comps at DC. Yeah. So I said, okay. I said, how about if I took your comps away? What would you buy of your own? What you make? What would you take? Nobody spoke up except one person in the back room. And he goes, not much. Yeah. And I said, okay, so we're in a situation here where you're creating books that you wouldn't even buy. I said, and how dare you? You know, we always have to keep you guys in mind when we're creating books. We have to know who we're selling to. You know, it's easy to say we're selling to a retailer because that's how it looks. But the reality is if you don't buy it, nobody's buying it. And if you go away, it's hard to get you back. you know? And it's an interesting thing to see and to watch, because ultimately, what we do, we have to win people over. And, you know, we can talk about what New 52 did and didn't do in the business, but we knew that we made a course correction that was a little too strong. And then we fixed it a little bit. And I think we're in better shape right now. And the fun part is, I'm sitting here with Justin and Alisa and Cole, he's not working. You're not working on any books right now, right?
No.
And you haven't created any brand new characters yet.
I mean, all the ones that I create, like, they just wash away in the ethics papers of what I do.
Okay, that's good. That's the way you should be creating these guys. How often do you draw?
Well, when I draw on purpose, it's like at home, but sometimes when they give us free time in school, I'm just doodling, I'm not paying attention at all, and then I look at it and I'm like, oh shoot, this is actually better than when I draw at home.
That's awesome.
Wait, can I jump in and say something about that? So the reason I think a lot of times what we doodle when we're, you know, loose and easy, and what we write when we're playing around is better and stronger than what we do when we're trying to do serious work, is that when you're in play mode, you're being creative and you're bringing all of your imagination to bear on something. And so one of the tricks to breaking into comics is to keep that doodle play looseness on an assignment where they suddenly say, more Superboy, no Superboy, change that page. So you need to keep those two sides of your brain going.
That's great. And I'm going to go to you for a second now, too. You're working, and what was great about what we did with Rebirth, like I said, we got back to that comfort food zone. We got the Gilligan's Island going, right? And ultimately, because everything's working, it takes the stress off trying to come up with the next thing to solve the next problem, to fix the next thing. And now we're creating new material. And, you know, even though we're about to, I mean, quite honestly, Mystic U is, for all intents and purposes, the start of a real thing that we're trying to do for young adults. And it's a different audience. And how do you write differently from that from what you're doing on other product?
Well, it's interesting because I think it's about, well, it's two things. Because one is it's about audience, and the other is about serving the story. So I think it's really impossible to write or draw anything well that you wouldn't be interested in yourself. So what I'm always trying to figure out, okay, so it's 14-year-old me. You know, it's 14-year-old me, and I'm walking into a comic book store, or I'm walking into a bookstore, and what would catch my eye, and what kind of story would appeal to me? And then, you know, because I also carry I've taught, I have kids, and so I carry other 14-year-old variants in my mind. And I try to be aware of them, not in an artificial way, like, you know, how do I pander to this demographic? But, you know, more sort of, what are the themes that really, you know, speak to me? And I think in terms of that young adult, it's about identity and proving yourself. You know, it's sort of like, am I good at this? What is my special talent? What's my power? And how does it feel when I'm with someone else and I thought I had some mastery over this power, and suddenly someone else is doing it better? And, you know, and so those are sort of the themes that I guess spoke to me as a teenager, and there's still like a really insecure, you know, 14-year-old inside of me that relates to that. And then also, it's sort of like, what did I find cool? I personally like really gross things. Like, there's a fatberg that is terrorizing. I kid you not. I see the people who are reading the stories I read. So under the sewers of the East End, which were designed for like a Victorian number of people, there's this fatberg composed of like the grease that people have poured down the drains, and disposable wipes and disposable diapers. And that, okay, I know that this is not true of everyone, but I love this stuff. Like my teenage stuff, like I really loved like weird, the gross, the strange. So that's sort of what I also try and keep aware of. I think I've babbled a little, and I'm going to stop now.
Wait, so is it like Swamp Thing, but pollution thing, basically?
Okay, so yes. So in the real fatberg is not, as far as I know, sentient, But, so I was inspired by the stuff that I was reading, which had a lot of blobby creatures. But also, my daughter just finished her first year of college, and she was describing the co-ed bathroom to me, and what was in it. And it was so disgusting, and I was like, I can use that. but the other side of that is I'm trying to think of the best way to, the things that disgust us, the things that frighten us a little, that's where things are interesting. Oh, and the other YA thing, which I want to say, is people forget that young adult, people are always looking ahead up until a certain point where I guess some people tend to look backwards. And so if you're writing for a younger audience, they're thinking about the future. They're thinking about what's coming up next. So that's part of what you also have to keep in mind. Deep nostalgia for first grade is not something you're probably going through right now.
Not yet.
Okay.
Last part of my secret origin which is just an interesting part right now. So, 12-year-old Dan DiDio. Couldn't hear here. 12-year-old Dan DiDio loved comics. And my sister was friends with this woman who had a nephew working in the comic business. So she hooked me up, and 12-year-old Dan DiDio got a chance to speak to Len Wein, had a chance to talk to him, and he gave me some insight into that. And then flash forward to the time when I get to work in animation. So I'm working at ABC, and then working for a company called Mainframe, doing shows called Reboot, and we're doing the called Warpline. So I was able to hire and Marv and Christy Marks and all these great people who I knew comic material from working with me. But I used to work with Len. And for those folks who didn't know, Len just passed away just a week or two ago. Yeah. So he's on everybody's mind. But for me in particular, I thought what was great is that I used to work with him, and he gave me so much insight, not just about comics, but just about the creation of comics and the history of comics and everything it is that made it fun. And some of the most things that I carry with me to this day still came from those days. And I know you probably knew him as well, and all these things on there. So I mean, it's an interesting thing to see. But again, it comes down to craft and knowledge being passed on, things that we know, and it all fills the repertoire of what we become later on. So you're just up now.
Now, can I ask you guys one question
Sure.
before I guess probably good.
Yeah, I think we're almost out now.
Okay, so my quick question is, are there skills or things, if you were going to say to people who want to be writers or artists, what skills can they work on, or editors, what skills can they work on and develop right now that would help them break in?
There's a couple of things. I'm going to approach from the editor's standpoint, and also on the writer's standpoint for a second. It's understanding that you're not the writer or the artist. That's the first part. It's one of your problems. You're hearing from our guys. What happens, a lot of people break in, and the editor has a story in their mind that they want a story to be, and they want people to implement the story that's in their head rather than what the talent is there to bring. So the goal of the editor is not to dictate, but to lead. Point them in the right direction, and even if it's not the same course, if you get the same result at the end, that's what matters most. And that's something we need to know. It's also something very important to realize too about where you address notes and ideas. That's another problem you face with. I'm looking because I know you've had all these troubles. That's why I'm actually bringing this up. From that side is, when you have a story idea, the basic idea of the story, that's at the plot stage. That's what you approve at the start. You agree this is what the story is about. Then you get to the outline, and the outline basically paces out the story. It tells you what happens on every page. Not maybe as much as the dialogue is, which is the final stage. You get the dialogue in the third stage. The worst thing you can do as an editor is try to change the plot or the outline when you write dialogue.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Because you don't understand how much deconstruction is there, and you should be addressing things in proper spaces. And since we're a periodical business, they got to learn when to let things go and when not to let things go. Because ultimately, the deadline leads to everything that we do. You're going to have to be on deadline. You're going to have to, when you say something's going to come in, it better come in, right?
Sure.
Okay.
I think if you're going to write, especially, I think the key skill is to actually write, which, that sounds like a no-duh kind of thing, but like, a long time ago, I made this, I call it, and it's probably an insult to Zen, my Zen mindset, which is way before I actually broke into comics. I'm like, I'm going to write, and it's going to be what it's going to be, and I'm going to write every day. And not literally every day, I don't write 7 days a week now, and I but 5 days a week. And now I have a goal. I try to write 1,000 finished pages a year, which I've hit every year since 2010, I think. But that's important. If you want to be a writer, you need to write. You need to say, you don't need to be thinking about writing, and you need to not confuse world building for writing or notes for writing. That stuff is useful, that stuff is necessary, but if you're not producing, if you want to be a writer who writes comic books, you need to produce script pages. You need to produce them regularly. You need to realize when it's time to move on to a new project. If you've spent an entire year constantly rewriting the same 22 pages, you've not grown. That will not get you anywhere. You can't polish a turd that much. You are better suited working on more new things rather than trying to perfect the other things. And that kind of discipline is how you build craft. That's how you build skill. People had said to me kindly that when I broke into comics, I felt like a much more polished writer than they would have expected for somebody who broke into comics. And it's because I spent 10 years writing thousands of pages of comics, and I was relentless about that. And you've got to be able to look at your work and evaluate it critically. And that's, it's hard to do. It's one of those things where you need to develop a sense for what you're trying to accomplish with the story, and then step outside your own head to read it as somebody who is not you, which is difficult. But I think it is a key skill for producing work well. But honestly, the other thing is, if you get in the habit of actually producing 5 or 6 pages every day, you will become a dependable, reliable professional that people actually want to work with, which is immensely handy. And it's the same thing with it behooves you as a writer to understand all steps of the process. You need to write a lot of scripts, you need to read a lot of scripts. You need to realize that you're not dictating to the artist. I don't ascribe to the Alan Moore process of writing 1,000 pages of description to get that kind of thing down there. The artist will almost certainly always have a better sense of the visual thing than you. So your idea is to get across the bones of the story for them to build on, and then when you go back, you put the meat on the bones that they've built for you. So it's a very symbiotic process, and you've got to realize that you're not dictatorial with artists. You don't get a good project if you try to do that way. If you're working with the artist, you will get a much better result. And that's a skill you have to learn. That's interaction with people. It actually relates to how Dan says you need to be able to give notes in a way that doesn't make people angry. Sorry, Cole.
I know these words.
Yeah. Your parents might be angry if I swear in front of you. I don't know, like a drunken sailor. And so you need to be able to communicate what you're thinking, and that's another part of writing is if you don't like something, you need to be able to tell somebody why you don't like it rather than some sort of vague thing. Like if an artist gives you a page, you need to be able to say what's wrong with that page if something's wrong with it, not, I don't know, I kind of don't like it. That's not useful.
Yeah. It's funny, it goes back, that's a key thing, and I just use this as the last story. When I was working in animation, I just started in animation, and I got in there, and I wasn't skilled to do the job I was in. I'll be honest with you, I wasn't. I came in, I'm an executive, some training in the background, but not really skilled in a lot of this. So I was working on a show called an animated version of Free Willy. I don't know if anybody ever saw the cartoon. But we hired 2 writers that were Emmy Award-winning writers, and they came in and they turned into the script. And as an executive in the network, you're supposed to be full of bluster, and your word is law, punch your fist on the table, and this is the way it's going to be done, whether people believe you or not. So I'm reading the script, and I went to the writer and I said, you know what, I'm reading the script and I said, the scene is not funny enough. And the guy looked at me, not funny? I said, yeah, not funny enough. And he looked at me, dead, put everything down, leaned over the table. He goes, describe fun to me. He goes, until you know what you're talking about, there's a couple of words that Cole, we're skipping today. Until you know what you're talking about, I'm not taking any notes from you. And he got up and walked out of the room. Wow. He says, I got 2 Emmy Awards, who are you to tell me anything? Got up and left. Now my job at that moment was one of 2 things. I could either go to my boss and say, I'm replacing this guy, he's belligerent, fire him. Or I could figure out what I'm talking about. So I took the script back, dissected it, put it back together, crafted 2 to 3 pages of notes of what I didn't like, wrote it all up, called them back for another meeting. I said, okay, you want to know why I don't think it's funny enough? I said, here, I wrote it all up. He basically looks at me, looks at the paper, pushes it back at me, and goes, I didn't think it was that funny either, I changed it already.
And the reverse side of that is, one of the reasons that I think I've done well in comics is if I disagree with an editor, I don't just stonewall and be like, okay, here's what I was trying to accomplish, here's what this scene is meant to do, and where it fits in the story. If that works, let me know, and agree. It's just that matter of Learning to communicate with actual people, which, you know, if you're a writer, there's a good chance you're going to be kind of introverted, and being an exception.
Even he has a security pillow. He
That's
puts it
true.
everywhere.
I let go of my security pillow for the panel.
Present.
It's a comfort pillow, first of all. My comfort pillow. Excellent. Well, you know what? Listen, I think we're out of time right here. I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank my panelists, Justin, Lisa, Paul. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for listening.